Life on the American frontier demanded more than courage. It required grit, adaptability, and a constant readiness to face danger from every direction. Between the harsh landscape, the unpredictability of human nature, and the fragile systems of law and order, survival was never guaranteed. The people who lived through it, cowboys, settlers, lawmen, and outlaws alike, navigated a world where opportunity and peril were often two sides of the same coin. These 10 realities strip away the romanticized myths and reveal the true nature of the West, raw, unforgiving, and shaped by those tough enough to endure it. Number 1. Life was cheap. In the Old West, the value of a human life could change with a single argument, a shift in the weather, or the wrong card being dealt. Disputes over land boundaries, stolen cattle, or a gambling debt could escalate into lethal violence in minutes. With law enforcement stretched thin, a single sheriff or deputy might be responsible for hundreds of square miles, making it nearly impossible to prevent crime, or catch every killer. In remote settlements, the nearest judge could be days away, so people often relied on their own guns to settle matters. This created a culture where hesitation was dangerous, and reputation often acted as a form of protection. The risks went far beyond gunfights. Disease and injury were constant threats, and the lack of reliable medical care made survival even more uncertain. Frontier medicine was limited, doctors were scarce, and treatments were often outdated or based on folk remedies. Something as simple as a deep cut could lead to deadly infections. Sanitation was poor, drinking water was often contaminated, and the spread of illnesses like cholera or typhoid could wipe out entire communities in weeks. With no antibiotics, prevention was as important as luck. Nature itself was another unforgiving opponent. Harsh summers brought scorching heat and drought, killing crops and livestock. Sudden winter storms could trap travelers and freeze them to death before help arrived. Flash floods and unpredictable weather patterns regularly destroyed homes and supplies. Wild animals, from rattlesnakes to wolves, added another layer of danger to daily life. Even a seasoned rancher or cowboy could lose his life from a single misstep in the wrong environment. Economic survival also came with high stakes. Competition over grazing land or water rights sometimes escalated into open conflict, like the fence-cutting wars in Texas, where farmers and ranchers fought fiercely over the closing off of open range. These disputes didn't always stop at property damage armed confrontations, and killings were not uncommon. For many settlers, maintaining control of their land and resources meant being ready to fight at a moment's notice. In such an environment, people quickly learned that showing weakness could make you a target. Strength, decisiveness, and a willingness to defend yourself were essential for survival. The reality of life on the frontier was not about romanticized adventure, it was about constant risk, adapting to threats, and staying alive in a world where safety was never guaranteed. Number 2. Outlaws weren't just in stories. In the Old West, outlaws were not simply colorful characters in dime novels or campfire tales. They were very real, dangerous individuals whose actions left lasting marks on frontier communities. Billy the Kid, born Henry McCarty, became infamous not just for his role in the Lincoln County War, but also for his repeated escapes from custody and ability to evade capture in the unforgiving terrain of New Mexico territory. He cultivated a reputation that made him both feared and oddly admired in some circles, even though his crimes included theft, cattle rustling, and multiple killings. Jesse James, emerging from the post-Civil War chaos, turned to bank and train robberies with his brother and the James Younger gang, targeting institutions he claimed represented oppression. In reality, these crimes were calculated acts that often ended in violence, with bystanders sometimes caught in the crossfire. Outlaws thrived because the frontier's vastness created natural blind spots for law enforcement. Towns might be separated by days of travel, telegraph lines could be cut, and sheriffs often had no jurisdiction beyond county lines. This meant that once a criminal crossed into another territory, or slipped across the border into Mexico, they could vanish for months or even years. Networks of sympathizers, whether through fear, family ties, or shared grievances provided shelter and supplies, making tracking them far more difficult. Well-known hideouts like Brown's Hole in the tri-state area of Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming became temporary sanctuaries for multiple gangs over decades. The pursuit of these criminals created its own dangers. Bounty hunting, though often glamorized, was perilous work. Rewards were not always as large as stories suggest, yet the risk of confronting a heavily armed outlaw was extreme. Many who took the job were either lawmen working off the clock or opportunistic civilians familiar with the land. Success meant not just finding the outlaw, but bringing them in alive, a task that often proved impossible. Many lawmen and bounty hunters ended their careers abruptly in isolated gunfights, their graves marked only by weathered wooden crosses, or not at all. The reality of outlaw life was less about heroics and more about exploiting weaknesses in the legal and geographical systems of the time. They were opportunists who understood the terrain, the limitations of their pursuers, and the value of fear as a weapon. While their names became part of American legend, the truth is that these individuals operated in a world where violence was a practical tool, survival depended on cunning, and the line between villain and folk hero was often drawn by who told the story. Number 3. Lawmen had it just as hard. Serving as a lawman in the Old West meant stepping into a role that was as dangerous as it was unpredictable. U.S. Marshals, sheriffs, and part-time deputies were responsible for enforcing the law across vast territories where communities were scattered, roads were rough, and communication was slow. They often worked alone, with no backup nearby, and carried out duties that ranged from arresting violent criminals to escorting prisoners through hostile country. Many had to track suspects across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain, sometimes into areas where the law had no reach, making every manhunt a potential one-way trip. The badge was no shield against danger. In many towns, political rivalries and personal grudges posed as much risk as armed outlaws. A lawman could be targeted by influential locals if his actions threatened business interests, land claims, or political control. Corruption was a constant hazard. Some officers turned a blind eye to certain crimes in exchange for favors or protection, while others were pressured to enforce laws selectively. Even the most upright officers were not safe from betrayal, and it was not unheard of for one to be ambushed by someone he thought was an ally. Physical threats were constant. Lawmen faced gunfights not only in the open, but also in crowded saloons, narrow streets, or dimly lit stables, where split-second decisions could mean life or death. Arresting a desperate fugitive was never straightforward. Outlaws often had the advantage of knowing the land and having allies ready to hide them or warn of approaching lawmen. The pursuit could take days or weeks, with harsh weather, lack of food, and the risk of surprise attack always present. Some officers never returned, their bodies lost to the wilderness or buried in unmarked graves far from home. Respect for the badge was not guaranteed. Some communities saw lawmen as essential protectors, while others viewed them with suspicion, associating them with unwanted government control. There were also those who straddled the line between law and outlaw peacekeepers, who were equally feared and respected, and whose methods sometimes blurred the boundaries of justice. This duality made the role complex. Maintaining order often meant earning a reputation strong enough to deter trouble while navigating the politics and dangers of frontier life. For a lawman, survival depended on more than marksmanship. It required adaptability, resilience, and the ability to read both people and situations quickly. Every day was a test of judgment, and every decision carried consequences that could ripple through a town for years. In the Old West, wearing the badge meant living with the constant knowledge that the next encounter could be your last. Number 4. Native American lands were taken by force. The story of the American West isn't just one of pioneers and expansion. It's fundamentally intertwined with the deliberate, often brutal, displacement of indigenous nations. What's taken for granted today as a familiar historical arc still resonates deeply, offering lessons about power, injustice, and the importance of confronting past wrongs. Centuries before frontier towns and gold rushes, Native peoples thrived across the continent with diverse cultures, languages, and systems of governance. But as settlers pushed west, backed by a government preaching manifest destiny, treaties were signed, then broken often without the full consent of tribal leaders, used more as a legal fig leaf for forced land grabs. The 1830 Indian Removal Act marked a turning point, ushering in policies that displaced tens of thousands from ancestral lands. Most tragic was the Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee and other southeastern tribes were marched to designated territories west of the Mississippi. Thousands died of disease, exposure, and starvation along the way. What some argue was framed as relocation was in reality structural ethnic cleansing. This pattern repeated across different regions. In California, the gold rush years unleashed widespread violence. Killings, forced labor, sexual assault, and expropriation of lands decimated indigenous communities. In one stark example, the Sacramento River Massacre, hundreds of Wintu people were killed in a single campaign, motivated by territorial expansion. Throughout the plains and Southwest, armed conflicts raged. Battles like Little Bighorn pushed back against encroachment, but couldn't stop the wave of federal military campaigns, settler militias, and resource orientation that steadily undermined autonomy. The cumulative impact was devastating. Population collapse, cultural disintegration, and the erasure of traditional lifeways. Yet these tragedies don't only belong to the past. Their legacies persist in ongoing disputes over land rights, cultural sovereignty, and historical memory. Recognizing these events for what they were: forced removal, ethnic cleansing, genocide is crucial to long-term understanding. It isn't about blame, but about truth and responsibility. Teaching these realities honestly ensures they aren't revisited or forgotten. This history remains powerfully relevant, shaping contemporary debates over indigenous justice, reparations, and collective memory. It serves as a reminder that societies built on displacement bear wounds that last generations, and that acknowledging and responding to those wounds is part of building a more just future. Number 5. The elements were as deadly as any gun. Life in the Old West meant living at the mercy of the land and weather, where each season carried its own risks and survival depended on quick adaptation. The vast plains and deserts could become lethal in summer, when heat and drought dried up water sources and turned trails into stretches of dust. Travelers on horseback or wagon risked dehydration within hours if they misjudged their route or underestimated the distance to the next reliable waterhole. For ranchers and farmers, prolonged drought could wipe out crops, weaken livestock, and trigger economic ruin. Without irrigation systems or weather forecasting, the only defense was experience and preparation, and even that was sometimes not enough. Winters were just as severe, with blizzards capable of isolating entire communities for weeks. The infamous winter of 1886-87 marked a turning point in the cattle industry when brutal storms swept the northern plains, killing hundreds of thousands of cattle and bankrupting ranchers. Even seasoned cowboys could be caught in sudden snow squalls that dropped temperatures to deadly lows in minutes. For settlers, the challenge wasn't just keeping warm. It was keeping food and fuel supplies from running out before the thaw. Sudden flash floods were another unpredictable threat. In arid regions, heavy rains upstream could send walls of water racing through canyons and riverbeds without warning, sweeping away wagons, livestock, and people. Campsites chosen for convenience could turn into death traps overnight. On top of this, the land itself was filled with hazards. Venomous snakes, particularly rattlesnakes, posed a danger to those working in fields or herding cattle. Without effective antivenom, bites often resulted in death or severe injury. Wildlife encounters could be equally dangerous, with predators such as wolves or cougars attacking livestock and occasionally people. Everyday tasks brought their own dangers. A misstep while breaking a horse could mean broken bones or worse. Wagons could overturn on rocky trails, crushing passengers or leaving them stranded far from help. Injuries that might be minor today could become fatal without proper medical treatment. Surviving in such an environment meant reading subtle signs in the sky, listening to the land, and making quick, often life or death decisions. Those who underestimated nature's force rarely got a second chance. The West demanded not just toughness, but constant vigilance and respect for an environment that could turn deadly in a heartbeat. Number 6. Boomtowns were a gamble. In the Old West, boomtowns sprang up almost overnight, driven by gold, silver, or railroad prospects. And with them came explosive growth, chaos, and risk. These towns attracted a flood of hopeful miners, merchants, and hangers-on, transforming remote outposts into bustling settlements overnight. Lured by the possibility of striking it rich, newcomers often arrived with little more than a pickaxe and dreams, and quickly faced the realities of skyrocketing prices, overstretched services, and moral disorder. Without time to build effective institutions like courts, hospitals, or basic infrastructure. These places were often wild and unwieldy. Saloons and gambling halls opened around the clock, fueled by desperation and excess. Fights over cheating, debt, or alcohol flared into deadly encounters, and saloon shoots weren't rare spectacles, but common hazards. Essential goods food, tools, shelter cost a premium. Supply shortages meant that a loaf of bread or a horseshoe could cost many times more than back east, and people who did hit it big had to guard their wealth against theft, scams, or violence. Such towns were fragile at their core. When the ore ran out or financing dried up, the boom collapsed just as fast as it began. Towns emptied in months, buildings were abandoned, and the vibrant clamor faded into eerie silence. Ghost towns popped up across Mines' footprints. Body in California, once home to thousands, dwindled to a handful of structures preserved in decay. Rhyolite in Nevada boomed with every modern convenience of its day: electric light, opera house, stock exchange, only to vanish when the mine failed. Lake Valley in New Mexico burned down after a saloon fire extinguished more than just prosperity. Yet not all boomtowns vanished. Some, like Tombstone, Arizona, managed to transition from mining hubs to historical legends. These towns redefined themselves through tourism and heritage, embracing their Wild West legacy to survive long after the gold disappeared. Still, most faded into memory, cautionary tales of how rapid growth without infrastructure, sustainability, or social cohesion almost always ends in bust. The story of boomtowns doesn't just belong to the past. Today, modern analogs continue in cities built around resource rushes, tech bubbles, or speculative investments. The core lesson remains: explosive economic opportunity can be intoxicating, but without balance, planning, and community resilience, prosperity remains fleeting and sometimes disappears overnight. Number 7. Cowboys faced more than just cattle. The reality of cowboy life in the Old West was far removed from the romantic image of endless horizons and effortless adventure. Cowboys were working men, often hired hands on large ranches, and their job demanded long hours, physical endurance, and a tolerance for discomfort. A typical day began before sunrise, with hours spent in the saddle driving cattle across open range. These drives could last for months, covering hundreds of miles through unpredictable terrain. The work was repetitive but dangerous. A startled herd could trigger a stampede in the dead of night, forcing riders to react instantly to prevent chaos and loss. Weather was a constant and unforgiving opponent. Summer heat could dehydrate both men and animals, while sudden storms brought lightning strikes, flooded trails, and biting winds. Dust storms could choke lungs and blind riders, making even simple tasks treacherous. At night, cowboys often slept on the ground, exposed to cold, rain, or the occasional predator. Sleep was interrupted by shifts of night watch, when they rode in slow circles around the herd, singing or whistling to calm the animals. Predators such as coyotes and wolves targeted livestock, while human threats came from rustlers who saw opportunity in poorly guarded herds. A moment's lapse in vigilance could mean significant losses. Injuries were common: a fall from a horse, a hoof to the ribs, or a horn from a panicked steer could put a man out of work for weeks. Medical care was scarce, and even minor wounds risked infection. The pay was low compared to the risks. Many cowboys were paid monthly, with wages barely covering personal expenses, and some finished the season no better off than when they started. Despite the hardship, the workforce was diverse, with African American, Mexican, and Native American cowboys contributing significantly to the trade, each bringing skills and traditions that shaped the work. Food was basic and repetitive: beans, bacon, bread, and coffee cooked over open fires. Comfort was rare, and the trail offered little privacy or respite. Yet, for many, the job brought a sense of skill, independence, and camaraderie. Success wasn't measured in wealth, but in the ability to endure, to keep the herd together, and to make it home in one piece. Number 8. Violence was a part of business. In the Old West, commerce wasn't just about deals and contracts. It was often enforced at the end of a barrel. Whether the issue was land rights, mining claims, or railroad routes, business frequently depended on violence or the credible threat of it. Companies, ranchers, and speculators didn't hesitate to hire gunmen or deputize enforcers to protect their interests, and legal disputes were sometimes fought with bullets more than in courtrooms. Rivalry over grazing land and water access sparked intense conflicts known as range wars. In Wyoming's Johnson County War, wealthy cattle barons faced off against small ranchers and homesteaders. The powerful outfits hired armed men to invade counties, prompting local residents to form posses culminating in a tense standoff only diffused by intervention from federal cavalry. These confrontations weren't isolated. They reflected underlying class tensions and the fight for economic survival. Mining disputes, too, turned bloody. In places like Aurora, Nevada, competing mining interests hired gunmen who terrorized entire towns. One gang effectively controlled local law enforcement while intimidating anyone who challenged their claim, leading to lynchings and brutal suppression of dissent. The boundary between business interest and criminal enterprise was often blurred. Even the rapidly expanding railroads weren't immune. The so-called railroad wars were literal fight-to-the-death competitions over strategic routes. Gunmen were hired, supplies sabotaged, and violent clashes erupted as rival companies vied to control essential corridors through mountain passes like Royal Gorge in Colorado. All the ordinary legal wrangling escalated into armed skirmishes with real casualties. Beyond land and mines, saloons and gambling halls were theaters of economic violence. Disputes over money, debts, or accusations of cheating could turn explosive. Without established law enforcement, business disputes were enforced through intimidation, ambush, or swift, deadly action. These violent business tactics weren't just flashes of frontier lawlessness. They were embedded in the structure of Old West economic life. Deals were secured not through handshake or court ruling, but through force, fear, or armed backing. For communities, it created a fragile peace upheld by power and weapons rather than law or principle. That legacy, whether viewed through the lens of myth or historical analysis, speaks to a time when capital and conflict were often inseparable. Number 9. Justice wasn't always just. In remote parts of the Old West, trials were not only rare, they were unpredictable. Courts were few and far between, so justice often depended on whoever happened to hold a badge or wield enough influence. In many cases, power landowners, businessmen, or town bosses shaped who stood trial and who walked free. There were stories of witnesses vanishing, or verdicts quietly decided long before any formal evidence was presented. Communities frequently took matters into their own hands. Vigilante groups sprang up in pockets across the frontier, claiming to bring order where lawyers and judges were scarce. These groups often started with community approval, but could quickly become instruments of repression, enforcing rough justice without due process. In Montana, miners formed vigilante committees during gold rush surges. They executed suspects suspected of robbery or murder based on hearsay or fear. Their actions, extrajudicial and urgent, reflected a broader lack of faith in formal law. Some entities, like the Bald Knobbers in Missouri, began with lofty aims to suppress outlaws, but gradually morphed into organized intimidation. They held mock trials, wore masks, and enforced their version of law without accountability. Justice in those years could mean standing before a mob that decided guilt with no defense allowed. Aside from vigilantes, informal legal systems emerged. Miners' courts, or people's courts, handled disputes over claims, boundaries, or debts. While they offered order, Their decisions lacked impartiality and could reflect popularity rather than fairness. Paper was often symbolic jurors, and referees were neighbors or rival claimants, and appeals were rare. When formal courts did act, they often relied on itinerant judges or justices of the peace with limited authority. Some, like the legendary Judge Roy Bean, were just one-person legal systems. Hanging, public executions, and lynching were common outcomes carried out swiftly, often in town squares, with no last-minute appeals allowed. Once a rope was around your neck, there was little chance to change anyone's mind. Legal safeguards like jury selection, cross-examination, and appeals were often unavailable. Justice could be arbitrary, shaped by coercion more than law. These conditions weren't just relics of a violent era. They ask us to reflect on the importance of institutions, transparency, and fairness. When legal systems are absent or untrusted, communities find their own ways to judge. That might bring temporary order, but over time it erodes fairness, memory, and sometimes even the truth. Number 10. Legends hid harsh realities. The popular image of the Old West clean duels at high noon, fearless sheriffs, and gallant outlaws has been shaped more by stories than by fact. The truth was far less glamorous and much more chaotic. Most gunfights were not staged, honorable showdowns, but sudden, messy bursts of violence. They happened in crowded saloons, dim alleyways, or on dusty streets where tempers flared over cards, debts, or drunken insults. Many ended within seconds, with bullets fired at close range, and often innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. Famous incidents like the OK Corral Shootout have been mythologized into tidy narratives, yet in reality they were confused, brief, and far from heroic. Even celebrated lawmen such as Wild Bill Hickok or Wyatt Earp were not pure embodiments of justice. Both operated in moral gray areas, sometimes making decisions driven by personal gain or survival rather than the letter of the law. Similarly, many celebrated outlaws were not principled rebels, but opportunistic criminals who robbed, extorted, and killed when it suited them. The shaping of these myths began early. Newspapers exaggerated events to sell more copies, while dime novels and traveling shows amplified the drama, turning otherwise ordinary men into legends and violent disputes into epic tales of courage. This narrative framing served economic purposes too. Tourism, local pride, and cultural identity often benefited from sustaining larger-than-life reputations. The daily reality for most people in the West had little to do with legendary heroics. Ordinary settlers, ranchers, miners, and merchants were more concerned with surviving the harsh environment, securing food and water, and protecting their families from both human and natural dangers. Violence, when it touched their lives, was not entertainment. It was a threat to their livelihood and safety. In truth, the Old West was defined less by moments of glory than by endurance. Luck, adaptability, and the ability to navigate unstable social and political environments were the real skills that determined who thrived and who failed. The mythology persists because it simplifies and dramatizes history, but those who lived it knew that survival often depended on avoiding unnecessary fights, keeping your head down, and being prepared for the unexpected. The gritty details, stripped of romance, reveal a West that was complex, dangerous, and shaped by forces far less cinematic than the legends suggest.